suddenly, which seems a fairly, which like 5 years ago or 3 years ago would have seemed a fairly standard recommendation, has become suddenly a major concern.
Trade wars between the US and China.
Absolutely. Yeah. We are in a situation, it's not only between US and China, it's between the US and many other countries. It is becoming an issue. It is undermining 70 years of progress toward an open, liberalized world economy, where one country says, I want to stop this. I want to get out all of my trade agreements. I want to get out the WTO. And so this goes evidently against our main mandate. Remember the mandate that I said, international cooperation thing? Well, this is a major concern. So we are struggling with this. Okay, next. Okay, now let's talk about some reforms. Okay, and I will be quick and I almost finished. So the IMF is trying to adapt itself to the 21st century. So what did we do? So we had 3 major changes. One was accommodating fast-growing emerging markets like yours. The second is to increase our war chest, and the number 3 is to be more flexible in our lending facilities. I will talk about the 2 first because the third one is too technical. It's not interesting. So the first one, let's get to the next one. In the 14th revision, quota revision, which by the way took 5 years to get approved. And why did it take 5 years? Because it needs to be approved at 85%. And why did it take to approve 85%? Because there was this one country who said, oh, it's not urgent, oh, it's not urgent, oh, it's not urgent. So it took 5 years to get this quota revision. But in that quota revision, developed countries lost 6% and emerging countries gained 6%. So India, China, all the others had their share increasing, and this was reflected in this big pie chart that I showed earlier. But we want to reflect the reality of world economy, so we want constantly to adapt the legitimacy of the institution to the world economy. And then go to the next one. Okay, so then we said, at the rate the world is growing and financial crises are coming, we don't have enough money, right? So what we did is we sold gold. We are the 3rd largest monetary gold owners in the world. No one knows that. But we have gold, plenty of it. Millions and millions and millions of ounces. So where are they? In the basement of the IMF headquarters in Washington. Very small part, yes, like 5%. But about 90-95% is happily kept for us by the US federal government in New York, in the vaults of the Federal Reserve. And you can go there and visit them. It's open to the public, and you can see. It's very impressive. If you go, you see gold bars, and there are numbers, and no one knows to whom they belong except some bookkeeper who knows number 13. This pile 13 belongs to this country or this place. Okay. So we sold of it because we have in our books they are at 1970 prices, and today they are 30-40 times higher. So we sold a small portion of it very quietly. We sold it to central banks, not to disturb markets, and we took the money and put it in a trust fund. We enhanced arrangement with the central bank, so we have ongoing credit lines. We can literally call up about 40 central banks in the world, including Reserve Bank of India, and say, there's a big crisis, we need money now, please transfer so many millions and millions of dollars. And so if we do that, we have about $1 trillion that we can throw at a fire anywhere in the world virtually within a couple of days. It looks a lot. The question is, it looks increasingly insufficient for the next crisis. We don't know when it will hit and how it will hit, but for sure it will hit. And so this is our main concern. And so the conclusion is, we have so far managed to get out the various crises, the Asian crisis, the Mexican Asian crisis in 2008 and 2009. We are, however, very concerned about the short to medium term, because there is a artificial crisis, sort of not made by the financial markets, but by some misbehaving or not misbehaving, it's right, some dysfunctionality in international cooperation, and that's very difficult to address because you cannot. You are this conflict of interest, right? The same people who are taking wrong decisions are not the ones that are going to listen to you when you are giving them advice. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about what we're doing and how we do it, and I'm more than happy to then answer your questions.
Thank you so much. Do you prefer questions one by one or in twos or threes?
I don't know,
Okay.
whichever.
We'll start by one. The only rule is make it a short, pithy question as opposed to a long statement of your life history or whatever. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. One question is about the BRI, and many countries are now aggressively receiving different forms of investment. And is the IMF now taking into a specific account BRI investment and how it might affect their macroeconomic indicators of different countries? The Belt and Road Initiative of China.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
What was the question? Can you reformulate?
So, China is now lending to different countries under these BRI projects. So, is in the all these consultations, is there going to be like a section on how BRI investments might affect the macroeconomic situation of those countries? To give you, for example, small example is Sri Lanka, which undertook a lot of loan, which was then converted into, they had to ultimately pay back, and they are running into trouble. China has now got an 85% stake in the port, and it seems to, increasing their debt ratio to GDP. So, is there now a section, or in the new evaluations, focus on BRI projects?
Okay, I get the question. So, the question is, do we have a special focus on China's BRI investments in selected countries? The answer is no, specifically, because those are investments, whether they are called BRI or development or partnership or I don't know, something. It's basically investment. And but for every country, as I said in the previous session, we do a debt sustainability analysis, and so this would be part of money that is coming in or projected to come in, and this would be then compared against the capacity of this country to repay. And we would look typically at a percentage of future debt service in terms of exports, because if you borrow in a foreign currency, you have to have that foreign currency. You cannot pay this back in national currency, so compared to exports. And also, if we are looking at public debt, we are also looking at the government's revenue, because you have to have government revenue to pay this back. So we would very clearly incorporate those into the overall debt sustainability analysis, but not specifically on China's investment or Russia's investment in Turkey or whatever. So we would look at definitely at the international, the consequences of international loans and grants. And yes.
Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. Firstly, thank you for this wonderful insight on the World Bank. So my question specifically was pertinent to what you spoke about the World Bank's feature being talking about energy resources. So I mean, if you could tell us a little more on how the World Bank cooperates with other international institutions like OPEC and basically other energy-oriented unions, and how that works, how that collaboration is put together.
Okay. So the question is energy and cooperation. So I will speak for the IMF, okay? So we are not specialists of energy issues. But what we try to do is to look at energy pricing. Because fossil energy in particular has a very wide-ranging macroeconomic effects in terms of pollution and environmental climate change and others. So what we would try to do is to work with governments to see first of all, how to diversify out from fossil to other energies, renewable energies, and everything that you do at the economic level has to do something with prices and costs. So we would look at what is the right pricing for a given energy product and how over time prices of fuel fossils should gradually raise so that other energies that are for the time being probably a little bit more expensive but are much more promising and renewable can then be phased in. And there are a lot of macroeconomic considerations, in particular tax considerations. There is a very large problem in many countries in the world about the subsidies, government paying companies to import fossil products and sell them under cost price to help supposedly the social the people. And so we look into all of this and we try to, but we do not build dams and we do not build nuclear power plants. We are trying to look at relative prices and advising governments on those.
Please, sir.
Hi, sir. Sir, the question is from a layman's perspective that I'm going to ask. Sir, the 2007-8 crisis was disastrous, and for the West particularly. It's difficult if we face something like that again, sir. So if the world faces something like that again, I think it's going to be very difficult in my opinion. So I want to know from you, from your experience and how you're looking at it, sir, is the world specifically staring at some problem like this very soon? Because when we see crisis in Venezuela or when we see crisis in Turkey or economic sanctions on Russia, because the answer you gave was that we don't know when it will happen or how it could happen, but you have experts from 189 countries and you have the best minds in your business. So is there anything specific you could give on that? So what are we staring at?
And follow-up, did the IMF see the 2008 financial crisis before it happened?
Okay, so the answer is no. We didn't see it coming, like no one else except two university professors who are well known and whose reputation was made on this, and ever since they are flying on a rosy cloud, because they wrote two articles very timely in which they said there might be a problem, and then afterwards, of course, everyone said, oh, but they knew. But except these two professors, no one else saw the problem coming. Where we were good was the G7 summit in London in the fall of 2009, where the G7 came together and literally said, the house is burning and we have no idea what to do. And if you go back to the G7 summit communique, it's 22 paragraphs, out of which 20 paragraphs makes an explicit reference to the IMF. And so what we did is we told central banks, everyone chills out, no one takes decisions, we are going to coordinate decisions. And this is when we started the unconventional policies, when the US said we are throwing money at it as much as necessary, and when the European Central Bank said we are going to provide as much liquidity as necessary. And so the first thing was for the two major central banks to speak together, and it was not a coincidence that they said the same thing within a couple of days, and from there on we started to coordinate, and then we came out relatively well, but the effects were very lasting. I mean, it took 5 years to come out. Now, you're absolutely right. This was a rich world's crisis. The rest of the world looked at it and said, gee, usually it's us who are in trouble and the West is having a good time, but this time they messed up and it's really hitting them, but because we are not well integrated in the world financial markets, the storm is in the northern hemisphere, we are reasonably isolated. And this is what happened. The problem is the next one is that in the meantime, advanced economies have more and more integrated the international financial circuits, and investment is increasing and is accelerating. So if a similar crisis were to happen, it would probably also hit this time the emerging markets. Okay? So we didn't see it coming, but we were good at putting out the fire because we coordinated. One of the first decisions, operational decisions that the G7 took was to make it mandatory to have an in-depth analysis of every country's banking system, once every 4 to 5 years by the IMF. We used to have those before the crisis. But when we went to the Europeans, or the Americans, or the Canadians, or the Swiss, and said, you know, we would like to do an in-depth financial analysis of your banking system, they laughed at us and said, oh, come on, I mean, we are Switzerland, right? We know banking, okay? So why don't you use your scarce resources on the small countries and the African countries, and we can manage our banks? Well, the first decision coming out of the crisis, that they had no idea what their banks were doing, and so it has become mandatory, and so now you see detailed, every 4 to 5 years, financial analysis on every country, including the United States, and we are very harsh on it. We told the Europeans, we were to tell the Europeans, you have to run stress tests. The European Central Bank was not running systematic stress tests on European banks before the crisis. Oh, you know, we know banking. Come on. I mean, we are Germany, right? I mean, we know we run banks. You know, we were there. You know. Well, you don't know, and you have to do it. And they learned it the hard way. The next crisis, we'll finish. The next crisis, no one knows, because some of the crises that you mentioned are self-created by governments. So those, you know, we know. I can tell you exactly how to destroy a country in 5 years. We have a perfect manual for that. What we don't know is the crises that are created by international market forces or international developments or new technologies. The 2008-2009 crisis was fundamentally a crisis of a very sophisticated derivative product, which even those who were promoting them weren't quite understanding what they were doing. So they were playing with fire, but they didn't know that they were playing with fire. So, and new products are coming out all the time. So there will be a new crisis. We don't know which way. It's never the classic way. You know, the Mexican crisis was very simple. You borrow in dollars, and you spend them, and you don't earn enough dollars to pay back. So there's a mismatch between your national currency. Big crisis. The Asian crisis was also very similar. Highly indebted countries, markets turn around, everyone panics. The 2008-9 was a very different. The next one will be very different. We don't know. So that's why we insist that we need to have cooperation and understanding and banks that work together. And that's why we are so concerned, because right now it looks like we are stepping back from international cooperation. So, but we don't know with what, but it will come. There has never been 20 years in world economy that hasn't seen a big crisis. So it will come.
Yeah.
So, good evening, sir. My question to you is pertaining the statements made by Madame Lagarde at the summit in Davos. She said that she knew about the rise of populism as a challenge to globalization, and in a way, it also hinted at how globalization has failed a considerable section of the populations in the countries, leading to a rise in income inequality. Since the IMF's goals is to address income inequality, how does the IMF intend to take into account the rise of populism and promote this through taxation or what?
Wow, that's a big question. That's for my son Nicholas. He does political economy and all kinds of fancy things. Populism is a political phenomenon, I stand corrected, whereby some group of politicians come to power and start giving preference to national interests, blaming difficulties on the outside, and promising things that are very nice on paper, but very, very difficult to realize, and certainly from an economic point of view, very difficult to finance. We cannot fight that. What we can fight is the causes. And as you said, some of the causes, and I hinted at this at the beginning, is growing inequality. If these populist movements usually thrive on that segment of the population that is the least wealthy, and usually who were pushed aside by global development. So, for instance, These are industries like coal mining, or some other industries that clearly were pushed aside because the world has moved on and we are now into electric cars. Okay? And so people have profound frustration, and they populists come and say, we can solve your problem if you listen to us, and solving the problem is to close the borders, to chase out foreigners, and everything will be fine. So what we're trying to do is we are promoting, and we are very hard working on more equal growth. So we would now look at distributional effects of growth. We will not simply say, in order to leave this country out of poverty, you have to grow, say, by 5% over the next 15 years. We would say that, but then we would add, and we want you to also to take specific decisions on how you are going to distribute this growth. Public finances are one of the best tools, because you can decide where you take resources from the wealthiest and what you do with it to redistribute it to the poor. And there are good models here and bad ones. So this we can do. But there are other aspects. Investments, savings, bringing down inflation, for instance, is very important, because under high or very high inflation, study after study has shown that the poorest are the ones that can the least defend themselves. The wealthiest, it doesn't matter. They lose some of their wealth, but it doesn't matter. But the poor are really hard. So these are the kind of things we have tried.
A question here?
Thank you very much, Mr. Zamorsky. My question is more actually focusing on the growth itself. So as we can see that the emerging countries like India in particular, almost double than the world growth levels. So pleasantly observing that IMF is doing some work on renewable energies, but the IPCC predicts that even if the entire world by 2100 would become completely renewable, there would still be about 2.5 degrees Celsius a temperature increase, which of course is disaster, because as of 2015 we have crossed 3 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. So 33% of the planet's capacity to sustain the population is gone. So in this particular case, of course, we are very aware of the fact that developing countries' growth is necessary, even for the lifestyle of the West, of the rich countries. So is the IMF doing any work rather than just focusing on renewable energy to substantially shift the degrowth of Western economies and move towards giving accommodation for growth for the emerging and the developing countries, which are of course 2/3 of the world's population? So degrowth of the rich countries rather than focusing only on renewable energies.
Well, that's a difficult question. So the question is on what the IMF does in trying to move the growth from advanced economies toward the developing ones, right? But first of all, let's not forget let's not overdo what IMF can do in the area. We are not the Paris Agreement, right? We are not the international forum where scientists and world governments come together and decide on taking concrete steps. And evidently, the United States pulling out of that agreement is a major setback, right? We cannot do degrowth. The advanced economies are already growing at less than 2%. So, and the emerging markets are growing much faster. The problem is that emerging markets, for instance China, they want to grow because they are a developing country and they want to raise the standard livings, but they need more and more electricity for that. And electricity generation is one of the major contributors to the climate change. It's very difficult to explain to a country, to China or to India for that matter, that rather than growing at 7% and hopefully getting out of the situation of extreme poverty, which is still a very large problem, well, why don't you just halve of it in the name of the global planetary good, and you don't build those power plants and you don't build those machinery that use electricity and so on. It's very difficult to explain this to a country. Very difficult. So whether we are going to win that war or not, I don't know. We may have already lost it. We don't know. I mean, we can see that it is a major issue. But our influence, honestly, is relatively limited on this one because we are facing other countries who say the US and Europe started all this mess 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Now they are at a stage where they can move into renewable, and so they are much more advanced. But we first need to get there before we can do renewable.
And so I took the question to be, is there any acknowledgement on the IMF's part that not all of the world can reach European standards of living? The planet does not have the capacity for everyone to have that level of development. And so is there any acknowledgement or any encouragement on the IMF's part to Western European countries or the US that that is not sustainable at a planetary level?
If this is the question, I don't think there is. I don't think there is this realization. But I think you cannot tell to 2/3 of the world, we will cap your growth because you are hurting the planet. I mean, every country wants to grow, and if we can do that in a more balanced way, in a more sort of reasonable way with renewable energies, yes. But we still want to grow, right? Yes, and please go back. Yes,
just
come
a
back.
corollary, just a very brief. The problem is that the United States, for example, which got out of the Kyoto Protocol in the first place, and then signed on to the Paris Convention. Now, per capita, it consumes about 380 kilojoules per person in the United States, and yet signs out of these conventions. On the other hand, IPCC calculates, for example, that for an absolutely Western European lifestyle, you don't need anything more than 150 kilojoules per capita. So that vast differential between per capita energy consumption of a US citizen, for example, and the per capita very, very insignificantly small consumption of a developing country citizen. So that is what I was referring to, that give the accommodations to the developing countries to grow, and the degrowth should be focused on, even though they are growing at a much smaller pace, on the developed countries. So does the IMF
Okay,
even
I
recognize
see.
that
Yeah,
problem?
I see your question maintenant better, and the answer is we were so in the case of the U.S., Al Gore's recommendation, which we supported, was to raise the price of the gallon of gasoline by 20 cents in the U.S. A, to curb consumption, and so to reduce emissions, and two, to use that money to pay down the humongous US debt. It's impossible to get the United States government to move in that direction. So what you're saying is very correct, but we don't have. We have recommended it. We have said you have to increase prices, and because it's, as you say, people should go for public transportation. You should.
There is no mechanism to.
There is no enforcement mechanism. Absolutely, there is no enforcement mechanism, especially against the largest economy in the world. Yeah, that is a serious issue.
Other questions? Yes.
So when the IMF, the EU, and the World Bank went to rescue Greece, so who was in the end calling the shots?
Well, you have to read the memoirs of the first finance minister of Greece who wrote, you know, the one that stayed, Varoufakis, who stayed 6 months, and he published his memoirs and couldn't be more critical of the Troika than he was. Who called the shots? I think it's a very good question. So the Troika, we had the Central Bank, European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF. the first question is, why did the IMF get into this, right? Because here we have Greece, member of the world's richest monetary union, with some of the world's most educated countries. So why on earth do you need the IMF? That you have both the financial means and the technical know-how. And the answer was, well, but we need a third party because it's otherwise going to be very complicated. Okay? So, but the IMF initially didn't want to come in. So we were persuaded by our friends who also are our largest members, saying we really need your help. And then we came in and we looked at the situation of Greece, and their problem is very simple. When they knocked on the door of the Europeans, their national debt to GDP was 270%. It's totally unsustainable. Talking about having a good time, right? You have a good time and then you wake up and you have a problem. And so from the beginning, the IMF said, this is unsustainable. We have to reschedule the debt. And the Europeans said, absolutely not. And that is unimaginable. All our banks are exposed. If we do this once, it will be a precedent. And so it was a very long and protracted and difficult discussions where we extended and put very tough conditionality. And eventually, after 3.5 years, a couple of months ago, Greece was officially off the programs, but at the cost of a tremendous adjustment and tremendous extension of the debt. So de facto, the debt was restructured from meeting to meeting to meeting. Who called the shots? It's difficult to say. There is, if you are interested in this, there is the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office did an independent evaluation on the Greek program. It's on the website. It's interesting, informative. It depended. What the IMF conclusion is, I think that we will not get back into an IMF, into a troika, because there were things we wanted to do from the beginning, like debt restructuring. Normal reaction in a situation like this is we call everyone around the table and say, okay guys, you need to take a haircut. We are going to come in, we are going to have money, we are going to have restructuring, we have conditionality, but you guys, you are the creditors, you were unconscionable when you let this country accumulate so much debt, you must take a haircut. And this is what happens in most of the countries, right? I mean, Argentina, there was a haircut, and Romania, there was a haircut. There were haircuts. The Europeans didn't want this. So the IMF wasn't happy about this. And a number of, interestingly, the IMF's conditionality was softer than the European conditionality. The IMF at some stage said, looking at the fiscal contraction that the European asked, this is unsustainable. This is crazy. So they agreed to it, and then of course it didn't work, so they relaxed it, and the IMF said, we told you so, but anyways. So to make a long story short, it was an interesting experiment, I think, but it's not going to happen again. Okay, maybe one last question.
A final question?
Another question maybe now?
From someone who hasn't said anything yet, one final question. How do I get a job at the IMF? Yeah. I would like to get a job at the IMF. Can you help me?
No, because you cannot hire someone from your family if you already have someone working at the IMF.
So you could step down and give me...
I will have... I am ready to step down if I also can step down as a father. Okay, so IMF jobs. We are a very specialized agency, and we are into macroeconomics. So we recruit mostly macroeconomists, PhD, best universities in the world, 25 a year, very, very, very competitive. You have worked in a Ministry of Finance or a central bank for 15 years. You went through the ranks. You are a director. You were very good. You are known as an international expert in area of field. And you come to work for us. Or you were a Minister of Finance or a central bank governor. You did an outstanding job and you got fired by the government because you did an outstanding job. We would take you. So we have lots of former ministers and governors in our staff, and we constantly send out our staff to become ministers of finances and central bank governors. It was the case also a few years back in India. So these are the main areas. We also recruit a few lawyers, international lawyers, but very few, and those who have usually we have experience working for international organizations. So it's very specific international law. We are a very small organization. We are only 2,700. That's smaller than JGU. Very small organization. We have about 1,200 PhDs. We are the highest concentration of macroeconomic PhDs in the world. We are the #1 employer of PhDs, and we hire the most. We are very international. We have 180 nationalities. Women have an edge. If you are a woman, you have much better chances to be recruited by the IMF than if you are a man. Sorry, guys. If you come from a non-Western, non-developed country, it's much better than if you come from a Western developed country. So it's good for you. You speak English, that's excellent. But you need to speak a couple of other languages. And you have to read crazy reports and write even crazier reports. Okay.
Final question. What advice would you have given yourself when you were 20 years old that might be applicable to the other young people in the room? Or in general, what advice would you give to the people here today?
If you have children, keep 2 girls, much easier. I have 2 boys and 2 girls. Girls are fantastic, the boys, it's a different story. So that's, otherwise, you have to, I think you have to do what you want, but you have to commit it. You cannot do it as a dilettante, right? You cannot say, it is going to work, I do it halfway. It's not. The competition out there is incredible. And it's just very tough, so it's not to discourage you, but if you want to do something, you really have to commit, pursue it, and hopefully you will find your way. I don't have a wisdom sentence.
Well, in any case, I hope this has proven informative or enjoyable or not too terrible for all of you. Thank you so much for this incredible turnout. Next time my father comes, which I hope will be soon, I will make sure there is enough room for everybody to have a seat, and I apologize for anybody who wasn't able to get a seat. Faculty and staff are invited for dinner at the Rendezvous Club in a bit. Students, we wish you the best. And if everybody would just join me in thanking my father. And we have this wonderful tradition here.